It's a life lived,
Your history.
Well, my life.
You don't think it's important enough to be doing what we're doing?
I never saw my my life as something unusual. I thought this is the way people lived, or some people did this, some people did that. And there was always something interesting about what people did or didn't do. Let me put it that way. Mm-hmm. But when you look at your own life, it never seems unusual. Yeah. Anyway, here we are.
Where would you like to begin, Roz?
Well, I was born. I was born in 1928. It was a home birth. This was on Flora Avenue. It was the heart of the immigrant area in the north end of Winnipeg. My dad was Joseph Wolodarski, my mother Florence Wolodarski. Were married in 1920, and by 1928, when I was born, I was the fourth child. We lived there for 2 years, and then my dad bought a house on Boyd Avenue. Presumably that was the first house that he had bought north of Flora Avenue, so that it was presumably a newer area in the north end. It was a big 2-story, 4-bedroom home, and that became the family home thereafter. I started in kindergarten at 4 years old, and then started in parochial grade 1. And at the end of grade 1, I was sick with pneumonia, and I was hospitalized for a while. So my parents decided at the time to send me to a public school, that it might be easier for me, which I don't think they thought that through that carefully, because I went to public school from 9 to 4, and then after that from 5 to 6:30 I went to parochial school. So that was my life until I graduated from high school there at the Parrott School. So I went to parochial school all the time and went to evening school at the Parrott School to learn Yiddish and Jewish literature, Jewish history, Jewish culture from a secular point of view. Yiddish was still very much the underpinnings of our life. Mm-hmm. We used to come home from the parochial Yiddish school. My dad would ask us what we learned, or to read us a portion in Yiddish. They would attend all of the concerts, the events, because the Parrott School was more than just a school for young people. It became a cultural center for parents as well. We always ate meals together. We went to parochial school, the Yiddish school, till 6:30. So the family would wait until we got home, those who were going to school. And it was always a meal that we sat down together. It was a very busy household, as you can imagine, with children. And we always had a renter living in the house. Economics were tough. So it was a busy household, but mealtime was always for the family. We would all sit together. In the public school, of course, at the time, we were all children of immigrants, and the process of Canadianization was very strong. And that's probably where my name was changed, and I have no recollection of it, but I suppose that that's what happened, that we were given more anglicized names. And a new way of thinking, a new way of perceiving. This was new, and our home life was of the old. It was sort of unspoken, but we felt that what we were learning at home or was sort of denigrated, was second best. So there was this tension that you were sort of, I don't know that I would say torn, but that you presented yourself one way at school and you came home and there was another personality or another way of looking at the world. And of course, we brought the language, the English language, into the home. My brother began to use that language more than the Yiddish. I suppose that while in one sense it was focused on the Yiddish, on the Jews and their history and their struggles and their culture, in another sense, we became aware that we were not the chosen people as some of the religious people would have categorized us. We were a people with a particular history, with problems that we had to face, discrimination, anti-Semitism, all that, but that we were one of rather than the chosen. So there was a sense of, and now I'm looking back at it, whether I consciously accepted that, I think I did, was that we became aware of other people and accepted that there were other, well, now we would call them ethnic communities, but that that we shared our environment, our place with other people, that they had their problems, that we could not only be concerned with our own problems, but we connected. It was a sort of, I think it was a belief in humanism. We would call it humanism now, that you had to be humane to everybody else. And we hope that would have been reciprocal. Sometimes it was, and sometimes it wasn't. But those were the beliefs, I think, that I attached myself to, or that I found very appealing when I got out of high school. One of my girlfriends, Tammy Bagel, who later became my sister-in-law, introduced me to this group of young people and took me to one of their meetings, this youth group that was just organizing, actually. And I don't know, it seemed to strike a sense of belonging. The ideology was very much part of my thinking at high school. Were more worldly. We were secularists, but a concern for other people's well-being, not only of Jews. And this resonated with me in the organization. And it seemed to me that, soon after the war, that there had to be a better way of organizing societies or organizing our lives that could benefit the greater majority of people than what we were seeing at the present time. So it resonated with me on different levels and opened up new avenues of that I hadn't explored as fully as I could before. So UJPO became very important to me, and we did some very interesting things. I don't think there was, in our home anyway, there was never explicit discussions about this. But I suppose when I think about it now, well, we accepted certain unspoken norms, I guess, would be the best way. I had religious grandparents. My mother was still quite religious. And I consciously, I'm not sure, but I knew that there were limits, even though my worldview would reject that. There was this acceptance. And so most of us did fall into line. We did, because we did find people with similar backgrounds that were part of the Jewish community. There were a few. We did meet with other, as I said, with other peoples from different communities, and we did become friends with them, and some of them we are still on very friendly basis. But at that point in time, we didn't intermarry. And as I say, there wasn't discussion on it. We never were told must do this or must do that. That was never a discussion that we had. But as I say, it seemed to be just part of our consciousness, or maybe unconscious. I don't think that we had discussions how it was changing our lives. I don't think that we were that aware of ourselves as such. But certainly it had an impact. It had, and it impacts us today even, And everyone, once in a while, you begin to think, how vulnerable you really are. But what's the saying there? But for the grace of God go I, which reminds me of, we went to see the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam. And there was this one picture, huge picture of Anne Frank. And I looked at it and I just thought to myself, my gosh. I said, Larry, who does that remind you of? And he looked at it and he says, you. And so that is always there. UJPO always had a different take on it. Our take was resistance, to show that Jews were not passive. They weren't sheep being led to the slaughters, as the saying goes. So this has always and remains our main focus, resistance. The Jewish community, their focus is on the Shoah, the destruction of what happened, how Jews were murdered. So there was a different sort of focus on how we looked at this. While UJPO, you can't deny the fact of the destruction. Still, there was a way of looking at it that there was resistance, that you could resist, and you did resist. And this became part of the history. In Winnipeg and across the country here, UJPO was at odds with the organized Jewish community. So at the very beginning, we did hold communal Holocaust events. Then we separated because of the differences. And then, of course, the politics entered into it. Soviet Union was now in disfavor, looked upon it, viewed it as communists. The Soviet Union was seen as the enemy. We entered into the Cold War period, and that entered into a whole new era for UJPO. And UJPO became, as all the left-wing organizations, became the target. The hall was blacklisted, and all the rhetoric that went with it. And so we were banned from the Jewish community, from the Canadian Jewish Congress, and Esther and I wrote a piece on that era. So that was a major era, and psychologically for each individual, that became, terror for the individuals, because we knew that we had to be very vigilant in our behavior. I suppose right after the war, things started to change, and we all started working. We graduated from public school and the parochial school, and we went out into the world. We all got jobs. We did not have the wherewithal to go to university. That wasn't even in our radar at the time. It was just not available to us. And so we accepted the fact that we would all, find work in whatever field. And it wasn't even preparing us into a profession or any, it was getting what you could, getting a job in whatever area that was available. So it was a different time and a different headspace that we were in. There was a pattern set out for you, a sequence of events. We followed the sequence. You worked, got married, then started with children, you bought a house, you had friends. So it was a pattern that you didn't have to figure out, should I take this path, should I take that path, where am I going from here? We never had those kinds of discussion. That came much later. We just followed the pattern. Even though, we called ourselves socialists, but we accepted that pattern as the norm. And we knew we would have children, so we knew we needed a house for a growing family. So there was no surprises in that, or no debate to have children, not to have children, to marry, as they're now, people, let's live together and then we'll marry later. There was no debate. You just followed the pattern. It was very convenient. We did have a different outlook, worldview, but that never entered into changing our pattern, our daily lives. That was only later with the women's movement that made us begin to question, is this the only way of organizing one's life? We did not discuss homosexuality, other forms of relationships. That wasn't within the realm of our discussion. It was more, our discussions were more worldly, what was going on in the world, rather than on, your own personal life wasn't as consequential as some of the major events that were happening around us. So our focus was directed differently than it is today, I suppose. Well, it's hard to say what draws one person to another person, exactly. I felt he was much more sophisticated than I. He was older. He was 8 years older than I. He had traveled more extensively than I had, and he had already been working for a number of years and had a car, and maybe that was the reason, I don't know. But we were able to discuss a lot of things, books and music, and he introduced me to a lot of, classical music when we went to concerts. So he opened up a whole new world for me that I hadn't been exposed to. That attracted me, I think. I really haven't thought about what drew me to Larry or what drew him to me, but I guess there was whatever it is that draws two people together, this magnetism or some kind of bond that we recognized. And, that lasted for 60 years, so that wasn't a bad choice. Although he became my major critic in everything that I did, and he was very, very supportive in some of my crazy ideas or some of my crazy activities. When I went back to school, he was he was behind me all the way. And that was a major effort on his part, I suppose, because he assumed a larger role in the family. He helped in the cooking, and he helped baking, and he went shopping, and he looked after the kids while I went off to a meeting or something like that. So there was never that fine line, although it's true, I did stay home to look after the kids, and he did. So there was that division of labor. But when he came home, things changed. He stepped in right away and took control of whatever was going on while I had this meeting or that meeting, and the kids knew that this was something that I needed to do or wanted to do, or it was just part of me, and they accepted that, and they still talk about it. But there was never a problem about it. He would be happy to stay home and look after the kids, and he had a lot of different interests. He did many things. He took a photography class. He went to art school, to the art gallery, and he had a real flair for art. So his interests were wide-ranging, and he had his own take on things. He wasn't slavish in his world politics as I was, and he tried to sort of balance it more than I did. So we would have discussions, debates, arguments on these things. But it was interesting. He kept me much more grounded than I might have been. So he had a major impact and input into my thinking and my development. Well, the wedding was very, very small. Larry just wouldn't hear of having a large wedding with hundreds of guests and so forth. So it was in our family home on 322 Boyd Avenue. The room was cleared of furniture, and then I guess they rented tables and chairs, and so it was, of course, the immediate family came. I was then teaching at the Parrott School, and so there were two principals, the co-principals, and so I invited them. Larry also invited his bosses at Warkoff Saphir and a few friends. So that constituted, and I don't remember how many people, probably 50, 60 people at the time. We did have a conventional Yiddish ceremony, and because of my grandmothers, my mother, the ceremony actually took place down the street at a rabbi's house. He lived half a block away from us. We all went there. I waited at home, hoping that somebody would come by with a car to take me over. This was December 24th, dead of winter. It was snowing and cold, miserable. Finally, Larry was the only one with a car at the time, so he decided he better come and get me. And then everybody came back to our house it was a catered kosher dinner, and then friends came after the dinner, and we sort of cleared up the space and had a little dance or something. So that was our wedding day. We had planned to honeymoon in Minneapolis, but because this was in 1949, at the very heart of the Cold War, we were unable, the Cold War period, and that was a particularly scary period where we were very careful about our phone calls, and we were particularly careful about, attending meetings. We always knew that there was some informer that was planted at these meetings, and that we would always try to see who it could be, who could this informer be, So it was a pretty scary period and left us with a lot of psychological hang-ups that I still recognize from time to time, sort of moving back or withholding your activities or your opinion. So you always had to work on or talk to yourself, about this, because this is, I recognize that this was always in the back of my mind, and it was a legacy that never sort of left you, given the fact that we were all from the left. And even, when Larry and I got married, We wanted to go to Minneapolis. It was the closest place to go for a honeymoon. And when we went to get our passports, they started questioning us and wanting us to give them names of our friends, our organizations, and of course, we left very quickly, never returned. I went back to work. I was teaching kindergarten, and I taught grade 1 at the Parrott School, and that was done in the Yiddish language. And Larry went back to his job at Work of Saphir, his only job. We lived with my parents, who had created this 3-room apartment in the house on Boyd Avenue. So my older sister lived there first, after my brother-in-law came home from the army. In the spring of 1950, they bought a house, and we were married in 49, so we had 1 bedroom, and they lived in the apartment. And then when they moved out in the 1950s, we moved into the apartment. And we stayed there till 53. Michael was born in 51, when we were still in the apartment. And in 53, we also bought a home in West Gildona, and that was being built up. It was a new development, and this was quite far north, we thought, on Burren Avenue, and it was a bungalow. We thought it was very modern, we thought, and big, because we had never lived in a house for ourselves. Spa came into our lives.
Yeah.
He lived with us. That was our Bible, sort of. So there was, I suppose, a different attitude than what our parents had, a more lenient, I wonder if that's the right word, more lenient, but more empathetic attitude to children, You had to be more aware of their feelings or how you were treating them than we had when we were growing up. Larry was much more gentle dealing with the kids. He would be the one to read books to them, and we have pictures of him sitting with them on the Chesterfield with an encyclopedia, which we bought, one of the first things we bought. And so, because I had the household and everything else, I would be more of a disciplinarian, I think, when I look back on it. I think they saw me as more difficult than their dad. He had a different impact on them than I was the activist. I was running to meetings here or had a choir practice there, Larry was more, he was happy to be at home after work with the boys, reading to them or whatever it was. I was busy making their meals and making sure that they went to their after-school Yiddish studies or going to hockey or whatever they were, soccer or whatever they were involved with. And around the table we would, sit and have discussions depending on what was happening in their lives or in our lives. And of course then there were the family weekend get-togethers, and they were very close to their cousins and remain to this day close. Of course, the kids were growing up. Michael was already 16 or so, and going into high school. And I found myself sort of at a loss, and the idea started to germinate in my head, what am I going to do with myself, or what interest am I going to take on, or what areas am I going to explore? And the idea, I don't know how exactly the idea came to my head to go back to school. I had to go back to get my grade 12 before I could enter into university. And I remember Kay George was one of the leading voices at the university. Kay George was a professor that came from Berkeley in sociology. And she was very influential on my life as well. She was a Marxist scholar. She was part of the One Big Union movement. And she was very strong in the feminist movement, particularly at the university, bringing that out into the open. So we were all part of that exciting movement. And that became part of my life and changed and began to change. Well, it began, you began to question your past, your decisions on what role that you had played and to rebel against it to a certain extent. In practice, we still maintained, and even I still maintain, the role of the mother, the organizer, the homemaker, even though Larry took on a lot of responsibilities with the boys, meals and shopping and all kinds of other things. I remember still, saying, let's have this for dinner, or we're going to, the social life. I still organized the activities for the boys. Larry did, would take the boys to their games or whatever their activities. So he took on a lot of responsibility. But I still maintain that role of the mothering role, and that continued. And I suppose I wasn't willing to relinquish that role. But even in my own thinking, and I was going through also a process of change, a change of thinking, because I can remember sitting in a class and thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot to take something out of the freezer for tonight's supper. Now, would a man ever think in those terms? Probably not. Part of me was still thinking that I hadn't moved that far yet, and that there was this process that I internally had to go through. But I remember moving, I could see, now I can see that, there was a change in my thinking, a change in my behavior. I had been socialized into a way of thinking and living, and here I was confronted with a new way, and I could see that I was moving away from the old into something new. Personal is political, until we began to understand, or try to understand, what that really meant, how political your personal life really was. Abortion issue, governments could intervene, birth control issues were all political issues. But that hadn't entered into our consciousness as such. So it took years before that seeped into our thinking and changed the way we thought about the world, about our own personal lives. We were never, that was not important. The personal wasn't that important. It was the larger society that we were concerned. Our personal lives were secondary, in the larger scheme of things. We lived our personal lives, and that was important to us, but not on a world scale.